I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Leonardo Iaccarino, a neuroscientist and assistant professional researcher at the University of California, San Francisco Memory and Aging Center. Dr. Iaccarino was first author on a recent study published in November of 2020 in JAMA Neurology that found an association between air pollution and Alzheimer's disease-related brain changes. Dr. Iaccarino, thank you for taking some time to join me on Dementia Matters.
Hi, Nate, and thank you really for having me here. It's really an honor. I'm super excited about this.
Well, great. So then we'll just jump right into it. And so before we talk about your actual research, tell our audience how you got involved in neuroscience and what sparked your interest in studying Alzheimer's disease and air pollution.
So, I originally trained as a psychology undergrad in Naples, Italy, where I was born and raised. And really into that, I really very soon felt like neuroscience, and actually particularly clinical neuroscience, was my calling. And this really led me to a journey to first Milan in Italy, and then to San Francisco, where I am now, for the last 3 years. And I've been working since on neuroimaging techniques and biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. And really, air pollution actually was a more recent interest for me. About halfway into my postdoc, I started to, being more and more interested in these modifiable risk factors. And air pollution really struck me as something that is interesting, is important for public health, and is something that we can act on in terms of policies. The interest was also related to our access to a very important database, which is the IDEAS study database. And this is the database that I used and we used for my study on JAMA Neurology.
And so a growing body of evidence shows air pollution can be added to the list of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So tell us about your research and why it's so pivotal. And this is the one, again, that was published in November 2020 in JAMA Neurology.
Yeah, so, there's been more and more evidence that exposure to different types of pollutants, airborne pollutants, is associated with a number of poor brain health outcomes. And these include increased incidence of dementia, accelerated cognitive decline, and so on. And really the leading hypothesis is that these brain health outcomes are associated, or let's say mediated, by actually cardiovascular and respiratory conditions that are really strongly associated and triggered by exposure to air pollution. However, our study kind of provides some evidence that even if these mechanisms are important, actually exposure to air pollution may contribute to brain health outcomes also through other pathways and mechanisms, and in particular, perhaps contributing to the accumulation of this brain pathology, which is amyloid plaques pathology. And so this is the idea, essentially, that kind of our study was aiming at, and provide an alternative for an alternative theory behind the poor brain health outcomes associated with air pollution. Really, the take-home from our study is that if you keep a number of medical, clinical, family history characteristics that we included in our models constant, so individuals with exactly the same characteristics, but these individuals would be living in different areas in the US with different pollution levels, they would actually have a different probability of having this buildup of amyloid in their brains. And this is really the take-home of the study.
And it's such an important take-home. But I also want our audience to understand what you meant by such a rich and important data set. And so you mentioned the IDEA study. Can you explain to us what the IDEA study was, and what you looked at specifically within that study?
Yes, so the IDEA study, actually, so IDEA stands for the Imaging Dementia Evidence for Amyloid Scanning Study, was a countrywide study led by my PI, Gil Rabinovich, in the US, and was enrolled actually more than 18,000 older US individuals with cognitive impairment, either a mild cognitive impairment or dementia, meeting appropriate use criteria for amyloid PET. And the primary aim of this study was to assess the impact of amyloid PET results on patients' management and care. So what we did for this study on associations of air pollution was essentially accessing the data originally collected in the IDEAS study, and then using the patient's residence zip codes to sort of merge the data acquired in the IDEAS study with the EPA air quality data, and test our hypothesis.
And fortunately, there are participants from all across the country in the IDEA study. Is that right?
Yes, they actually the density, let's say the geographical distribution of individuals in the IDEA study largely reflect the population density in the US. So that is also very important. Actually, this is a very important point: is that the IDEAS population, first, it's a uniquely large cohort to study such an association, and second, it's really geographically dispersed in the US, which for us at least, allowed to look at the entire range of PM2.5 and ground level ozone concentrations in the US.
And in your study, you talk about air pollution. So what kinds of air pollution are you referring to?
So we consider two different pollutants, either particulate matter 2.5 or ground level ozone. So as for particulate matter 2.5, this is, particulate matter itself is a mixture of solid and liquid droplets, and these are suspended in the air, and so they can be inhaled. And depending on their size, they may have different effects on our health after being inhaled. So when you see like PM2.5, this really refers to concentration of particles that have a 2.5 micrometer diameter or less. And just to give you an idea of this size, so the largest PM2.5 particle is about 30 times thinner than an average human hair. So really the idea is that these particles are so small, and when they are inhaled, they can deposit in different places in your airways, and they can also even enter your bloodstream or reach the central nervous system. So PM2.5 is one of the most studied pollutants because it seems to be particularly bad for us when inhaled. And the other pollutant we looked at was the ground level ozone, which is a gas, and can be also has been associated also with poor brain health outcomes. In our study, however, as you know, we only found an association with PM2.5.
And so what kinds of things can generate PM, these particulate matter 2.5 microns or less?
Yeah, so first of all, PM2.5 can be also naturally present in the aerosol. It can be associated with, for instance, sea salt, dust, but then can also be secondary, let's say, so can actually be produced in different ways, also by human-made activity, of course. And actually, in the cities, on like very densely populated areas, most of the PM2.5 is actually secondary. And PM2.5 can be either directly emitted, so can be actually emitted directly from activities like constructions, or can also be produced by natural events like wildfires, for instance, in California, where we are very worried about this, or can actually result from chemical processes actually happening in the air. So other particles and gases can react together and sort of clump together and kind of result in these particles.
And for those in more densely populated areas, do cars, for instance, generate particulate matter 2.5, or being near a factory? Are those potential sources?
Yes, so emissions, this type of emissions can be definitely associated with the, ultimately with the concentration of PM2.5 in a given area. So yes.
And so how does air pollution increase the risk for Alzheimer's disease? Or why do you think there was this increased biomarker of amyloid in people with this risk?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. So, it's also one of the, in part, an aspect of this study that we have been thinking about a lot, about the interpretation of the findings. The leading hypothesis, and so we are not the first ones to show such an association. There have been previous studies also in animal models and in cellular studies actually showing very similar findings, but we kind of take this concept and we tested this hypothesis on a very large human population in vivo. And the leading hypothesis is that anyway, inhaling these particles and breathing them in somehow triggers an inflammation response, a systemic inflammation response. And this inflammation response can also result in inflammatory responses in our brain that in turn may lead to accumulation of amyloid plaques. The idea really is that we have a physiological system to sort of clear up amyloid plaques or clear up amyloid. And also we have a physiological system that's kind of have under control the production of amyloid peptides and proteins. The idea is that when we have these inflammatory responses, when these inflammatory responses become chronic, these physiological systems are altered, can be impaired. And this is one of the hypotheses behind the association between exposure to air pollution and increase of amyloid pathology that we have observed.
And do you see a dose-dependent relationship? And for our audience members, what I mean is that if you are exposed to PM 2.5 more intensely than others, meaning it's more dense in your city, or if you're seeing it over years instead of just a year, do you see that there's a further increased risk?
This is another excellent question, Nate. So in our study, we did not really have access to, let's say, this type of information. I think the leading hypothesis is that we should be worried about chronic exposure to even not particularly high concentrations, but still like chronic and long-term exposure to these pollutants. Not really like single events, for instance, even if I think we should be worried about that as well. But in terms of brain health, seems like this long-term chronic exposure is what we should be particularly wary of.
And you did not find that relationship with ground level ozone and then this amyloid in the brain. So what does that finding mean for us, for the non-neuroscientists?
So definitely. We on one end, we kind of liked that there was a specificity, let's say, associated with the association with pollutants in our study, meaning that we found something for PM 2.5 and not really for ozone, saying that we were looking at a specific probably mechanism, rather like less likely to be non-specific. And as for the ozone, one thing actually that I want to bring up also for PM 2.5 is that in the last years, the air quality in the US has improved a lot. So, in the study, we looked at the two different bienniums as like biennia, as time windows. One was in 2002, 2003, and then a more recent biennium, 2015 to 2016. And really, in this 14 years sort of range, the air quality has improved a lot for PM 2.5. And also ozone has not changed a lot, but the levels are not worrying. And really, we could not find an association with ozone. And compared to literature, when actually you can see these results, these findings, for instance, between exposure to ground level ozone and increased incidence of dementia, usually these are done in places or areas that have a much higher concentration of ozone. So our take on this is that maybe the levels we have observed in our study were not high enough, or perhaps being ozone a different pollutant compared to PM 2.5 with different chemical and physical properties. The effect of ozone may be associated with another type of brain health outcome that was not found or observed in our study. And also maybe in different populations. We have looked at a population that is very specific, that is older individuals that are already cognitively impaired. So either in a mild stage or in a more advanced clinical stage. But we had no cognitive normal subjects in our cohort. So maybe, looking at different populations may also provide further insight on this, let's say, difference between the associations of PM 2.5 and ozone.
Well, it's good news to hear that our air quality has gone up over the past few years and more recently. Another thing about your study that I appreciated is that you had to control for a lot of other factors when doing your analysis. So things like medical conditions, lifestyle behaviors, and socioeconomic level. You even looked to see if gender had a role in your findings, and it seemed like the answer was no. I'm wondering if you were able to look at the ApoE4 genetic risk. were certain people at higher risk of having this effect from air pollution versus others?
Yeah, we controlled for a lot of other factors, as you are mentioning, and this was also to kind of try to be as specific as possible in our statistical testing to, understand whether there was an association between pollutants, exposure to pollutants, and likelihood of being of having a positive amyloid PET scan, controlling for these other factors that we know are associated with either the amyloid PET positivity or also with actual exposure to air pollution, like, for instance, cardiovascular and respiratory comorbidities. Yes, we indeed looked also for if gender had a role. And this is because in some of the literature has been shown that there could be actually a role of gender in how you are vulnerable to exposure to air pollution, but we really could not see that in our data. And you're absolutely right, thinking of ApoE genetic risk. We unlikely did not have access to ApoE info for the participants included in our study. That would have been absolutely important and interesting. There is already evidence that if you are a carrier on the ApoE4 allele, you may be more vulnerable to exposure to air pollution. So that would have been very interesting.
And then taking what you found and trying to apply it to our listeners, to the US population in particular. There's an estimated 5.8 million people, 65 and older, that have Alzheimer's disease. So when we look at that, this may mean that tens of thousands of cases of those with Alzheimer's could be partly at least attributed to air pollution. So knowing this and keeping this in mind, and not that I'm trying to rouse fear, but what should people do with the information that you have now found?
Yeah, this is also an excellent question. Let me first maybe clarify, Nate, that what I'm thinking is that our study does not really demonstrate that exposure to air pollution is like a cause of Alzheimer's disease. We show that it is associated with, let's say, an increased likelihood of having this specific pathology in the brain, which itself is, a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease dementia in your lifetime. So even having a positive amyloid PET scan does not really say that you have Alzheimer's disease itself or that you will have dementia in your life. There are also individuals that are perfectly cognitively normal who actually have an amyloid positive PET scan. The way we have to think about this is that it actually just increases the risk that you may have in your lifetime. You may end up developing Alzheimer's disease dementia, but it's not, like a cause of it. And we can definitely air pollution is not a cause of Alzheimer's disease. It is indeed looks like it's one of the possible risk factors, so like contributing to the risk overall. And what should we do with this information? Well, I think we can be more mindful of our exposure to air pollution. We can do actually, like very concrete actions we can take to limit our exposure. We can check, for instance, how is the air quality in our area. We can take actions like even wearing a mask. It's something that we used to do also before the pandemic, but during the wildfires, to limit your breathing in these particles that are suspended in the air. So it's something that we should think of just in our lives, I think.
Such an important clarification, and thank you for making that. And also a very interesting point about wearing face masks prior to our pandemic. And thinking about how people should really consider their risk and make informed decisions. Is there a way for a person to know what their own neighborhood value is of this PM 2.5, or is this only something that researchers and scientists have access to?
Well, the data we used in our study are like specific, sort of more complicated data to deal with, published by the EPA. But actually, there are also way more approachable data on our air quality in your neighborhood. And yes, you can actually, there are like a lot of resources to check your own air quality. For instance, there is the Air Now website, which is a US government website, where you can literally just enter your zip code, your resident zip code, or any zip code, then you will have instantly like what is the air quality with a number of different parameters associated with it. So it actually is pretty straightforward.
Oh, that's great to know, and good for our audience to know that they actually could take a look in their own neighborhood. I also think of your findings as potentially something that may have an impact on policy. Do you see some sort of future conversation about potential system changes and not just individual ones?
Well, yes, this is actually our conclusion in the study is that policymakers should consider these findings, and not only our study. Like in the same months, there was also another study providing complementary findings and very convergent findings. And I think now there is a very coherent story coming up from literature. And yes, I think policymakers should consider this because, as also this other study I was mentioning, we do see these associations even in ranges of values that are considered normal or like not problematic. Let's say considering the standard, the current standard. And so like even trying to lower the standard more, or thinking of other actions at the policy level to increase the air quality, I think they could go a long way.
And do you believe there might be other environmental factors that could be these modifiable risk factors, such as water quality or sound pollution you hear about, or even things like pesticides, herbicides?
Definitely, I think there is evidence for all the factors you have listed, and usually with air pollution, you also think of environmental noise. It's another factor that has been determinant, or factor that has been now it's being now more and more studied, and all these elements together, they sort of go to this larger umbrella category, which is these social determinants of health. And these are now becoming more and more important, and I think they deserve a lot of attention by future studies.
And I'm so glad you're working on this because there is such a great overlap here between these social determinants and Alzheimer's disease and the environment. And so I look forward to more of your studies coming out. But I always like to end an interview with a more personal question. And so, what do you do in your own life to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease?
Yes, this can be a difficult question, I guess. I've been taking some actions. In general, the way I approach this is that really anything you can think of that is associated with your general health is actually also associated and is very likely to be also a modifiable risk factor for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And this includes, like looking at your blood pressure, having like your physical exercise. One other important aspect that has been becoming more and more important is also watching your sleep quality. All these elements that actually just contribute to our general health in the long run have been associated with Alzheimer's disease. So right now, personally, I'm working on my physical exercise and other lifestyle changes. So I'm not a smoker, but smoking would be another important element to think of. These are the steps that we can take. I'm like slowly, maybe perhaps a bit lazy in a lazy way, but I'm trying to take action myself.
Well, thank you for being honest and
Yes.
answering that question. And again, like to thank you for being on Dementia Matters, and I hope to have you back when you have more results.
Thanks, Nate. This was awesome. Thanks.
Please subscribe to Dementia Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts. And rate us on your favorite podcast app. It helps other people find our show and lets us know how we're doing. Dementia Matters is brought to you by the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. The Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center combines academic, clinical, and research expertise from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health and the Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Center of the William S. Middleton Memorial Veterans Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. It receives funding from private university, state, and national sources, including a grant from the National Institutes of Health for Alzheimer's Disease Centers. This episode was produced by Rebecca Wazaleski and edited by Bashir Adine. Our musical jingle is Cases to Rest by Blue Dot Sessions. Check out our website at adrc.wisc.edu. That's adrc.wisc.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. If you have any questions or comments, email us at dementiamatters@medicine.wisc.edu. Thanks for listening.